The Condition of Labor by Henry George. Part 4. The Remedies that Fail. Believing that the social question is at bottom a religious question, we deem it of happy augury to the world that in your encyclical, the most influential of all religious teachers has directed attention to the condition of labor. But while we appreciate the many wholesome truths you utter, while we feel, as all must feel, that you are animated by a desire to help the suffering and oppressed, yet it is painfully obvious to us that one fatal assumption hides from you the cause of the evils you see, and makes it impossible for you to propose any adequate remedy. This assumption is that private property in land is of the same nature and has the same sanctions as private property in things produced by labor. In spite of its undeniable truths and its benevolent spirit, your encyclical shows you to be involved in such difficulties as a physician called to examine one suffering from disease of the stomach would meet should he begin with a refusal to consider the stomach. Prevented by this assumption from seeing the true cause, the only causes you find it possible to assign for the growth of misery are the destruction of working men's guilds in the last century, the repudiation of the ancient religion, rapacious usury, the custom of working by contract, and the concentration of trade. Such diagnosis is manifestly inadequate to account for evils that are alike felt in Catholic countries and in Protestant countries, in old countries and in new countries, amid all varieties of industrial customs and relations. But the real cause will be clear if you will consider that, since labor must find its workshop and reservoir in land, the labor question is but another name for the land question. What is producing throughout the civilized world that condition of things you rightly describe as intolerable is nothing less than the progress of civilization itself, acting in a state of society based on private property in land. The discoveries of science, the gains of invention, have given to us in this wonderful century more than has been given to men in any time before, placing in our hands new material powers. But with the benefit comes the obligation. In a civilization beginning to pulse with steam and electricity, it will not do to be merely as just as were our fathers. Intellectual advance and material advance require corresponding moral advance. The deepening pain, the increasing perplexity, the growing discontent for which, as you truly say, some remedy must be found, and quickly found, mean nothing less than that forces of destruction swifter and more terrible than those that have shattered every preceding civilization are already menacing ours. If it does not become indeed as in word a Christian civilization, on the wall of its splendor must flame the doom of Babylon, thou art weighed in the balance and found wanting. One false assumption prevents you from seeing the real cause of the facts that have prompted your encyclical, and it fatally fetters you when you seek a remedy. In all that greater part of the encyclical devoted to the remedy, while there is an abundance of moral reflections, the only definite practical proposals for the improvement of the condition of labor are these. First, that the state should step in to prevent overwork, to restrict the employment of women and children, and, where there is danger of insufficient wages provoking strikes, to regulate wages. Second, that it should encourage the acquisition of property in land by working men. Third, that working men's associations should be formed. These remedies, so far as they go, are socialistic, and though the encyclical recognizes the individual character of man, the whole tendency of its remedial suggestions leans unmistakably to socialism, hampered by a supreme respect for private possessions, yet socialism still. Of these remedies, the widest and strongest are that the state should restrict the hours of labor, the employment of women and children, the unsanitary conditions of workshops. Yet how little may in this way be accomplished. A strong absolute ruler might hope by such regulations to alleviate the conditions of chattel slaves, but in the industrial slavery growing out of private ownership of land that prevails in Christendom today. It is not the master who forces the slave to labor, but the slave who urges the master to let him labor. Thus, the greatest difficulty in enforcing such regulations comes from those whom they are intended to benefit. It is not the masters who make it difficult to enforce restrictions on child labor in factories, but the mothers who, prompted by poverty, misrepresent the ages of their children. Men do not overwork themselves because they like it. It is not in the nature of the mother's heart to send children to work when they ought to be at play. It is not of choice that laborers work under dangerous and unsanitary conditions. These things come from the sting of poverty. In so long as the poverty of which they are the expression is left untouched, restrictions such as you endorse can have only partial and evanescent results. The cause remaining, repression in one place, can only bring out its effects in other places, and the task you assign to the state is as hopeless as to ask it to lower the level of the ocean by bailing out the sea. Nor can the state cure poverty by regulating wages. It is as much beyond the power of the state to regulate wages as it is to regulate the rates of interest. The general rate of wages is fixed by the ease or difficulty with which labor can obtain access to land, ranging from the full earnings of labor, where land is free, to the least on which laborers can live and reproduce, where land is fully monopolized. Thus, where it has been comparatively easy for laborers to get land, as in the United States and in Australia, wages have been higher than in Europe, while as monopolization goes on under private property and land, wages tend to fall and the social conditions of Europe to appear. The same hopelessness attends your suggestion that working people should be encouraged by the state in obtaining a share of the land by buying out large landowners in favor of small ones, establishing what are known as peasant proprietors. Supposing this can be done, what will be accomplished save to substitute a larger privileged class for a smaller privileged class? What will be done for the still larger class that must remain, the laborers of the agricultural districts, the workmen of the towns, the proletarians of the cities? And if the state attempts to buy up land for peasant proprietors, will not the effect be, as is seen today in Ireland, to increase the market value of land, and thus make it more difficult for those not so favored and for those who come after to get land? On the principle which you declare, that to the state the interests of all are equal, how will you justify state aid to one man to buy a bit of land, without also insisting on state aid to another to buy a shop, to another to buy the tools of a trade, to everybody who thinks he could make good use of it? And are you not thus landed in communism? But aside from all this, any scheme of dividing up land while maintaining private property in land is futile. Small holdings cannot coexist with the treatment of land as private property where civilization is materially advancing and wealth augments. We may see it in the fact that, while 2 centuries ago the majority of English farmers were owners of the land they tilled, tenancy has been for a long time the all but universal condition of the English farmer. And now the mighty forces of steam and electricity have come to urge concentration. It is in the United States that we may see on the largest scale how their power is operating to turn a nation of landowners into a nation of tenants. The principle is clear and irresistible. Material progress makes land more valuable, and when this increasing value is left to private owners, land must pass from the ownership of the poor into the ownership of the rich, just as diamonds so pass when poor men find them. There is one way, and only one way, in which working people in our civilization may be secured a share in the land of their country, and that is the way that we propose, the taking of the profits of land ownership for the community. As to working men's associations, what Your Holiness seems to contemplate is the formation of societies akin to the friendly and beneficial societies which have had a large extension in English-speaking countries. Such associations may promote fraternity, extend social intercourse, and provide assurance in case of sickness or death. But if they go no further, they are powerless to affect wages even among their members. As to trades unions proper, it is hard to define your position, which is perhaps best stated as one of warm approbation, provided that they do not go too far. For while you object to strikes, you use expressions and assert principles that are all that the trades unionist would ask. You speak of the insufficient wages of workmen as due to the greed of rich employers. You assume the moral right of the workmen to obtain employment from others at wages greater than those others are willing freely to give. When fire shall be cool and ice be warm, when armies shall throw away lead and iron to try conclusions by the pelting of rose leaves, such labor associations as you are thinking of may be possible. But not till then. For labor associations can do nothing to raise wages but by force. It may be force applied passively, or force applied actively, or force held in reserve, but it must be force. They must coerce or hold the power to coerce employers. They must do their best to get into their hands the whole field of labor they seek to occupy and to force other working men either to join them or to starve. The condition of the masses today is that of men pressed together in a hall where ingress is open and more are constantly coming, but where the doors for egress are closed. If forbidden to relieve the general pressure by throwing open those doors, whose bars and bolts are private property and land, they can only mitigate the pressure on themselves by forcing back others, and the weakest must be driven to the wall. This is the way of labor unions and trade guilds. Labor associations of the nature of trade guilds or unions are necessarily selfish. By the law of their being, they must fight for their own hand, regardless of who is hurt. They must do their best to starve workmen who do not join them. They must by all means in their power force back the man seeking work, a fellow creature in all probability more pressed and starved than those who so bitterly denounce him, and often with the hungry pleading faces of wife and child behind him. I speak without prejudice against trades unions, of which for years I was an active member, in pointing out to Your Holiness that their principle is selfish and incapable of large and permanent benefits, and that their methods violate natural rights and work injustice. I am only saying to you what, both in my books and by word of mouth, I have said over and over again to them. What I wish to point out is that trades unionism, while it may be a partial palliative, is not a remedy. That it has not that moral character which could alone justify one in the position of Your Holiness in urging it as good in itself. Yet, so long as you insist on private property in land, what better can you do?